Okay, so while the previous 2 weeks have dealt with Illustrator and all of the various types of outlines you can do in Illustrator, this week we're dealing all with mostly with the fill, and maybe working with that with the lines. But the first assignment, if we bring that up, there we go. I called it color schemes for lack of a better word. So I have something here, and in the end, I'm going to want you to make 5 different copies of it and use different combinations of color with all of these elements. So right now everything's kind of cool, blues and greens, it's very muted. You might make one that's really neon colored and one that's lots of warm colors, etc. But before we do that, there's a few things I want to show you about how fill works in Illustrator. So if I just draw out, the default rectangle, I'm going to add a bit more line just so we can see it. So we've been dealing with stroke, right? Pen tool, line tool, all these kinds of things. But there is something on the inside, and of these 2 swatches, it's the one that doesn't have a hole in the middle. And if I double click on it, I can get a different color, and I can also see there's a color palette up here, kind of like a quick way to get a general color, but I can't see all my range of colors. So normally when I'm switching colors on something, I go over here and I double click, and I can choose the color that I want. Quick note on this color picker, I think I went over it before, but in case not, this slider is the color of the color, right? So the wavelength, basically, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, purple, and then back to red. And then this box, right is most saturated, left is unsaturated. So everything on the left is actually grayscale because there's 0 saturation of the color. It's just black to white. And then top to bottom is lightness to darkness. If you're dealing with print materials, what that means is that basically no black ink, all black ink, right? So you're going from like 0% K ink to 100%, which I think is how this registers here, because we are in CMYK. If you're dealing with video, which is RGB and the amount of light, it's kind of the reverse. Basically, this would be 0 at the bottom because there's no light, and then going all the way up to the top where you would have 100% light. So how we measure it depends on if you're dealing with print or video, but needless to say, light to dark, saturated to unsaturated, and I'm going to choose the color. I like the purples. There we go. So and you can actually see that's not the color I chose because we're in CMYK. The default in this program is CMYK because that's your print colors. If you would like to use the really bright colors because you're designing for something that's outside of the print realm, then you go to File, Document Color Mode RGB, and it'll switch in. Now it doesn't update this to what I wanted. I have to go back in here and say, see how it's all the way down here? I chose a color up here. Ta-da! Now it's brighter. So if you're wanting to deal with the really bright colors and it's not letting you, that's why. In the future, you're going to have to know what your end game is. You're going to have to know what you're working towards before you choose your color mode. For example, like a lot of professional printers might deal with CMYK, but if you want to send like a photo album to, whatever printer to be printed up for your family, they actually only deal with RGB. So it depends on where you're going. All right, so the fill can be solid. It can also be, you can see if I have this selected, there's an opacity up here, and it applies to both the fill and the outline. But we can change the opacity. Let me move that up here. There we go. So we can see it's semi-transparent. If you're staying within Illustrator, this is fine. If you're going to be moving out of Illustrator to like a video program, After Effects, Flash, etc., some programs handle this better than others. So buyer beware about how much you're working with opacity and opacity gradients in particular. If I want to get rid of the outline, I just select the stroke over here and I select the one that says none. Maybe I just want the fill and nothing else. That's what all of these are. There's no outline on any of these. Also under opacity, there's the amount. You can also change, actually let me move this back over here, how they're interacting. There's different modes. We'll deal with this a lot more in Photoshop. Darken, multiply, lighten, screen, all of these. There you go. So there's overlay. It changes how they interact with each other, right? So you can see that interacts a lot differently than just general normal, hey, this is slightly pinker than usual opacity. So keep that in mind. All right, back down here. Come on. So let's say we want not a solid color, we want a gradient. So step one is to come over to the palette menu over here and select the one that looks like a gradient, which is always universally in Adobe programs is going to be this kind of bar that goes from like darker gray to lighter gray. And if I click on it, right now it just says type blank because there isn't one. So I can say linear and nothing happens because I was on the wrong swatch. Let's try that again. Have this selected, gradient, linear. There we go. So I have this object selected. I make sure this is in front. Now it defaults to a black and white color scheme, which means we're going to have to kind of trick it a little bit into putting color into here. So this right here, this bar, is sort of a preview of what the gradient is. And it shows up here because you can actually move the gradient to like going off of this shape and things like that. But these two little house boxes here are showing you what colors you're going between. So if I double click on the one that says black, right now these are my only choices. And I could change it from white to white, but that seems silly. But if I go to this swatch over here, and I choose any old color, doesn't even matter what color. Now, when I go back to this color picker here, I get something that looks a little more familiar. I get green, blue, purple, red, whatever you would like. And I can actually change how I look through these colors here. So I can say, let's see, HSB. So this is what I'm used to dealing with is HSB, which is hue, right? So that's the color of the color. And then the amount of saturation. So I can grayscale it out, or I can make it really blue. And then the amount of darkness or lightness to brightness to it, kind of. If you're thinking that's familiar, that's because that's what this is, right? This is HSB. Same thing. So if you like dealing with HSB, that's what I recommend. And then of course I can double click on the other one. I might be able to tell it to, yes, there we go. All right, I can tell it. I don't see it still. I gotta pick a color first to get it out of black and white mode. It's kind of crazy. And we're gonna go from blue. We're not gonna change it very much. We're gonna unsaturate it, lighten it up. There we go. It's a little bit harder to deal with it manually like this, but it's a good practice to understand how these things work. All right. So that's how we would get a gradient on this. Now, that's linear. If you would like radial, you just do that. Or we go back. All right. So let's say we want the gradient to actually be moving up and down. Now, obviously, this is a it's a square, so we could do that. Actually, technically, it's not. It's a little bit wider than it is long. So let's say whatever it is oblonged, and we need. There we go. So I need the gradient to be going vertically instead of horizontally. There is a gradient tool over here. And it's a little bit tricky, but basically you can see there's the base here. It looks like a circle. And then there's a smaller node over here. And if you go a little bit outside the smaller node at the top, you'll see it swings up. Now, if you hold down Shift, it'll swing up on 90 degrees, and it'll recenter itself afterwards, so don't worry about that. And then if I click the bottom one here, I can move it so that it's at the edge there. And then I have to hover over this black node at the top to shrink it back down. So this is what I meant by this over here in the palette is the preview of the actual gradient, because you could theoretically have a gradient going off the shape, and so you wouldn't really know what it looked like, and so you got to kind of work with both of these things. And you can see that it has both of these carets in here, and it's got that middle point. So, and they interact with each other. So those parts you can, come on, there we go. interact with here. You can see that this midpoint can basically say, well, we want most of this to be light, or we want most of this to be dark, right? So you can kind of change where the center is. The other thing we can do is we can add, if I add one here in the middle, a new gradient color. And so I'm going to double click here and I'm going to say, well, it's going from, we're going to go to a completely different bonkers color. There we go. All right, so I've chosen this purple color to kind of sit in the middle, and I can change it so that it's much more up here, or I can make it so that the purple is a small band in the middle. There we go. Between the blue and the light green. So you got a lot of control over, a lot of pretty easy control over how these gradients work. All right, and the last thing is that I'm gonna unselect this and I'm gonna reset my colors to just standard, right? So let's say I draw something else. That's boring. Let's use a star. There we go. So I have a star, drawn a star. I'm like, oh, I want it to be this gradient, but like, you don't want to have to redo that gradient over again. Well, if you have the new thing selected and you use this eyedropper tool, which is I on your keyboard, and you click on the old one, it gives you the same gradient. Now I have to spin it around because I think this is oriented differently, or just because. But at least you get the color scape, so that part's easier. And you know, getting the gradient to rotate around 90 degrees is no big deal. There we go. And I just move it down here. Perfect. So there you have it. And then that way, I kind of want there to be less of the, there it is. And this is why you would want to control where your gradient is, by the way, because on a more complex shape like this, maybe I don't mind that more of it is this light green color because there's very little there. Whereas this middle part, there's the volume wise, it's not even like here. So you can kind of get away with cheating it a little bit. But using the eyedropper can come in really, really handy for transferring color from one place to the other. So I'm going to get rid of these things because I don't need them. And we're going to look at this. So how does this apply to this? Well, first off, I'm trying to get you guys to work more efficiently. So when it comes to making copies of this, I just want you to take it and go Control C for copy, Control V for paste. If you're paying attention when you drag it around, you can line it up so that it's, you know, they're kind of in, you know, nice little line there. So there's no remaking everything all at once. Now you'll notice, if I collapse this, that I've got it set up with groups, right? This is just extra nonsense. I don't even think it, yeah, there's nothing there. Delete. These groups are each one of these, right? So if I select this, that's that one, and that's the one on the far right. Each new one gets put on top of the old one. So I've done this because this is standard operating procedure. When you have lots of different pieces, in this case 6 pieces, I don't want to be like selecting an individual one and then I move it accidentally and then I have to put them all back together. So what happens when I want to alter only one? Well, there's a couple ways you can do it. One of them is to simply deselect it here and select one piece here. But that gets kind of tedious because it's hard to know, you know, which of these squares is which one of these here. A better way to do it is to get used to going into objects and then back out of them. What do I mean by that? Well, if I click on this, if I double click on it, you'll see everything else gets grayed out, but now these are behaving individually. My layer here says isolation mode. I am within this group, so it's not even letting me see anything else. I cannot touch anything else. You know, it shows me where there's anchor points, so in case I wanted to line something up together. It also says it over here that I am on layer 1 group. Now, once I decide that this should be neon colors, I could rename this group to be something a little more helpful. All right, but it allows me to change the colors. There we go. for this one group pretty intuitively, and then I can back out later. So I can take this and I use my eyedropper with the I key, and then V brings me back to my regular selection tool. And what goes well with orange? We'll go full on 80s with this. How about that? There we go. Again, using the eyedropper because I don't want to be bothered with changing things. And if I make that white, what is that going to look like? All right. Now, on purpose, I left this one with, half opacity, because how things work when you're dealing with half opacity is actually, part of something you need to keep in mind, because, there we go. That's terrible. Because it's gonna change, things can't ever be as punchy necessarily, and so I wanted you to kind of get a feel for what's gonna happen when you do that. So you can change how semi-opaque it is if you would like. Ha ha ha. See, there we go. So it's a little bit more difficult to get something that's going to function the way you want it to, just because it's a little tricky. It's a little, semi-transparent. So here, it's really punchy with the yellow, because the two colors, when you see through the green, it makes the green, and you see the yellow through it, it makes it a little bit greener. Punches it up a little bit. But when I had it as black before, it just kind of looked like a lame, and you can even see it on the purple. The purple is contrasting with the green, and so it makes it less zippy. So getting the look that you want, slightly more complicated when things are semi-transparent. So that's just there to be a little bit of a foil for you. But when you're all done, you hit this arrow. You have to hit it twice because you have to get out of the layer and the group. But now we're back here. Everything is by itself. And then I can actually double click on this and call it like 80s or something, so that I know that that's what this one is. So if I double click on it again, it tells me I'm in the 80s one. Oh, you can also double click on the artboard out here to get all the way out in one double click. All right, and so what I want you guys to do with this is to eventually have, there will be 6 total. You have the one you start with and then the 5 that you make. And I want to just see that you have 6 total that are different color schemes. Go to town, try different things. Some people writing gradients. There's a couple of really fun, ridiculous swatches in here. Just experiment. This is very typical in art to have different color schemes just all laid out, so you can pick which one you want and see, or narrow it down at least, and then you have the more subtle changes. And so this is standard operating procedure, especially in this program, because it's so easy to change the color. It's so easy to change all of the colors to what you need them to be. There we go. Rather than having to, repaint things in Photoshop or Magic Wand Tool or anything like that. It's just, everything in here is very, very quick. So I want to see 6 different swatches. Make sure when you're done, some people still aren't doing this. You need to put your name in here somewhere so that I know it's yours, so I can give you credit. And make sure you're saving. You should be saving more often than I just did. That was terrible of me. I went 18 minutes without saving. Don't do that. Alright, so that is the first assignment on this week's homework.